Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching the concepts video for DHCP in Server 2003. In this video, we want to take a look at some concepts that describe DHCP and go through these and explain these to give you a better overall understanding of how DHCP works. Now, we don't have a lot of different concepts for DHCP, but we will go through some of these, and these will be beneficial for just general overall knowledge. Some of these are covered on Microsoft MCSE exams, and it'll just help to better overall understand how the DHCP process works. Now, the first one, boot P, you may have heard of before. This refers to the bootstrap protocol. And very often, boot P and DHCP are talked about pretty much one and the same. Okay, and you've probably heard of DHCP and maybe you've heard of boot P, but you should be familiar with what it is. Boot P basically is the modern improved version of DHCP. Okay, and essentially when this method first came out, IP addresses were assigned to computers based upon a computer's MAC address. So it was a little bit more work than what DHCP was. You had to go through and you actually had to find out the computer's MAC address, and you created a table of MAC addresses and then the associated IP address that you wanted to assign to that computer. When a computer booted up onto the network, its MAC address broadcast out, it found this DHCP server, and the DHCP server was able to match up the MAC address with its database and then send back an IP address to this computer. So that was early forms of DHCP, and it's really not used anymore, but you still see reference to boot P all the time, especially when you start working with Cisco equipment. So I think it's important to at least be familiar with boot P was, and from a historical perspective, understand it. Now, our next mention here you probably have heard of in dealing with DHCP, and these are scope options. And I'm really bringing these up right now more along the lines to explain our next two concepts, server options and then user vendor classes. Okay, so scope options though, these allow us to assign additional settings configured along with IP addresses on a DHCP server. Okay, and we say that these settings are scope specific here, and we're going to go out and now explain to you why that is, what I mean by that actual little portion there. So we're going to form a remote desktop connection out to server 3, and server 3 is acting as our test system here just to demonstrate a couple things with DHCP. Now, this machine's just a standalone server, nothing special about it. It does have DHCP installed on it, and I have configured a couple scopes just to point out and demonstrate a couple concepts to you. Okay, so here we have server 3, and what I've done here is created two different scopes, so we'll be looking at both of these. Scope 1 covers 192.168.1.0, and Scope 2 covers the 192.168.2.0 network ID. Now, if you're a little bit confused by what this is and you're new to DHCP, don't worry about it. You can maybe come back and watch this again after you've gone through the videos, but this will help you to get a better idea of what a scope is. Okay, so first off, remember a scope, this is what we just used to create the address pool of IP addresses that a DHCP server assigns. Okay, and you can see over here, you know, this particular one, scope, and it's called the Green Lizard Books Network Scope. Well, it assigns IP addresses between 192.168.1.1 ending in .254. It also has a range of excluded IP addresses, and those are 225 through 254. And you would have exclusions for things like servers, routers, printers, stuff that, that will have a static IP address. Now, what we're focusing on specifically here are our scope options. Okay, and these are configured typically when you go through the wizard when you create a scope, and as I mentioned before, we will go through this in Labs 1 and Labs 1 and 2. Scope options, though, they do have some more advanced settings that we can take a look at. And here you see our scope options. These are the three that we set up initially. If you want to configure these or change these, however, some people don't know how to do that. And all that you really need to do is right-click on any of these, go to Properties, and here you see your general available options. Now, router is selected here, and this is one of the ones that we had selected previously when we went through the wizard. And then you see a whole slew of other scope options. These other scope options, for the most part, are not necessary, and you shouldn't be messing with these. We have, you know, some 75 different scope options here, give or take, because they're skipping numbers, but quite a few. A lot of these are here only to maintain compatibility with that old boot P protocol that we were talking about before, and you will never have a need for setting these. Okay, so this right here, option 3 can be set. Option 6 we use. We also use options 44 and 46, and these would be used if we were using a Win server. Okay, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get through the go into the actual scope configuration later. Okay, so option 44 and 46 can also be used if you do use a Win server. For the most part, though, the rest of these are not used, and you won't have a reason for using these. Okay, so these are scope options, and what I wanted to point out to you, scope options are specific to that individual scope. So here you see for this scope that covers the 192.168.1.0 network ID, we have these particular scope options. They're specific to this scope. For this scope, 192.168.2.0, we have a different set of scope options. Take a look, just pick one of these out, for example. Hopefully we have some of these settings that are different, but 254 for the router, 100 for the DNS server, and the DNS domain name is wbc.local. Well, if we go down here, we see that they are different. The router has an IP address of 2.254, the DNS server is at 2.100, and we don't have a DNS name. Okay, so specific scope options for each of these different scopes. All right, so that's all that we really wanted to point out initially for scope options. Let's take a look at our next choice here, server options. Server options are just like scope options. They're additional settings configured along with IP addresses on a DHCP server. However, these settings take effect on all of the scopes on a server, okay? On all of the scopes on the server. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Well, if we come back over here again, you know, here we only have 2 scopes, so it's not too much management. But, you know, you may have a DHCP server that's holding 10 scopes. Okay, and across those 10 scopes, you may have a setting that you want that's consistent across all 10 scopes. So, for example, our DNS server setting here. Maybe I only have 2 different DNS servers on my entire network. Okay, and instead of having to go through 10 different scopes and assign a different setting on each of the 10 scopes, I can use server options instead. Okay, so what I'm going to do right here is let's just delete these options. Okay, so I'm going here to this other scope option. I'm going to delete DNS servers. And you wouldn't have to do this, but I'm deleting these to make a point here. Okay, so we go to server options. And now when we first set these up, I said to myself, you know, the DNS servers are the same no matter which scope these DHCP clients are coming from. So I'm going to come over here to server options, okay, and just configure this one time. So I select, oops, that's not the one we're using, DNS servers, okay, and if I want to put the name in, I can, but we'll just use an IP address. I add the IP address, click add, and then click OK. Okay, and now what we see is that we have a server option here for 192.168.1.100. If we go back over to our scope options, you look and you see that this has been added to this particular scope. Now, it's got a little bit different symbol here, okay? And don't ask me what the symbols are supposed to mean, but this is a individual scope option, these 2 little cogwheels together. And this one here, the cogwheel and the server, this is a server option, okay? And notice what we did. I configured this setting here under server options, and now this option is going to go here, and it's going to go here, okay? So it just appeared there automatically. And like I said, I may have 10 different scopes, okay? 10 different scopes, and this server option is going to appear in each one of those scopes. Now, last thing here, let's say that I did this server option and I've got those 10 scopes you're just talking about, but on one of them, I decided that I don't like this particular option. What I can do, I can still go in here to my scope options, and I can come down here to DNS servers, and maybe I want this to be 1.200 instead. Okay, look what it does here. It actually kicks that server option out and it puts the client option back in place. Okay, and it's not because I did this last and it kicks that one out. It's because if you configure a scope option here on this individual scope, that is more specific than a server option. Okay, and scope options will always override server options. Now, if I come back over here to the second scope, you'll notice that that server option is still there. Okay, on this one, we still have the scope option. So there's your difference between server options and scope options. For the most part, especially on smaller networks, there's no reason to even mess with server options, but it's there to speed up the process anytime you may have to configure, multiple scopes. Okay, next we have user vendor classes, okay, and these are advanced methods of configuring DHCP scope options. Now these are a little bit confusing, and this is something you may have not have worked with before, so we'll take a little bit more time to go over this and explain these user vendor classes. And once again, I'll reiterate, if this is the first time you've been exposed to DHCP and you're kind of lost with what we're talking about here, I do recommend that maybe you come back to this and watch this after you've gone through the different labs, 1, 2, 3, and 4, because I think you'll have a better understanding of what's going on after you see that stuff. Okay, let's go take a look at what this is for and how this works. So we're going to connect back over to server 3, our DHCP server once again, and we'll continue on this exact same server with the different scopes and the server options that we had before. Now, what you have here, we have general scope options. Okay, so for example, let's just focus on this one scope here. This is going to apply to any machine that exists on this 192.168.1.0 network. So, picture this a little bit. You've got all sorts of users. You got salespeople. You got people in the accounting department. You've got people in the IT department. 150 or so users. When they boot their computer up, all of them are just randomly assigned an IP address and then general settings based upon our scope options here. Okay, what if we want to do some more advanced things? For example, what if we have one group of people that we want to get different settings here? Okay, and one thing that comes to mind, maybe the accounting department. Maybe they need to access a different part of the network, some secure location, and you really don't want the rest of the people, okay, in your company to be able to access this subnet. So what we could do, we could change this default gateway option. It's referred to as router here. We could change this just for these accounting people. Or we'd like to do that anyway, but how do we do it? Because there's no place here to say, well, if Joe, Jill, and Sue connect, we'll give them this default gateway. How do we arrange this? Okay, and that's one of the things that these advanced options will do for us. So let's take a look here. And to get to these advanced options, we need to right-click on Scope Options, and it could be this one, or Server Options. Okay, and you need to make sure that you know what you're doing here, because if you click on this Scope Options, we're going to be configuring these advanced settings for this particular scope. And I think that makes sense when we're looking at it now, but when you take a look at these advanced settings here in a second, it's real simple to get these, all these convoluted and mixed up together, and you may get confused by it. Okay, if I went here to this Scope Options, I can configure advanced settings, but they're only going to apply to this scope. And then once again, if I go to the server options and do advanced settings, well, those advanced settings will apply to both scopes, just like we saw previously. Let's focus on just our first scope here, 192.168.1.0. If I right-click on Scope Options, I can go to Configure Options, just like we saw before, and then here are our basic options that we can set right here. And this is just the same as we saw previously. If we click the Advanced tab, however, we get a couple items here. One is called User Class, and the second is called Vendor Class. Okay, and pay attention to this because I do think that this is a little bit confusing. Well, the User Class, this is referring to different types of users that may be connecting to the network. Okay, and this default boot P class, well, this, you're not going to really belong to this because this is for previous clients, boot P clients, so you won't have to worry about this. Default user class is basically everybody, and what I mean by that, well, any computer that boots up, they're going to be assigned to some sort of class. Okay, and if you're not assigned to a class, then you're part of the default user class. And if you look here, kind of makes sense. Here are those options that we saw before, and if you look at the option assignments for default user class, well, they match up to exactly what we see here. Router is selected, and then option 006, DNS servers are selected as well. And if I select it, it's going to match this number here. Okay? Now, if I wanted to change this, I could select this default routing and remote access class if I needed to, but this is only referring to people who are, dialing in through a routing and remote access server like a dial-up server or a VPN. So this isn't going to do anything for my local systems. Okay, so this isn't going to help me. And we already mentioned that this wasn't going to help me. Okay, so what I can do, I can actually set up a different class. Okay, so let's move on that same example that we were talking about before. Let's assume that we do have an accounting department and they have some unique situations where they need to connect to that secure network, and our goal is to give them a setting that's going to make their default gateway different than all of the other users in the company. Okay, so their default gateway is going to point out to an IP address that's just on this secure little subnet. Nobody else will be able to reach it because they won't even know about it. And these accounting users, they'll be able to reach it just, without even thinking twice about it. Okay, so to do this, first thing we have to do, let's just go ahead and close this. We're going to have to come up here to server 3, right click, and then go here to define user classes. Okay, and you see right here, these user classes, we have default boot P class, and we also have default routing and remote access class. Now, the default users class is not listed here because since it's just a catch-all, well, everybody's in here. So you can't do anything to it. You can't remove it or edit it or do anything to it at all. So we're just going to click add, and what we'll type in here is accounting. Spell that right. Okay, accounting. I forgot my N still. There, accounting, finally. Okay, description. You can put in here what you want. Secure network access. Okay, and then something that's kind of funny here. Normally when we see this stuff here, ID and binary, we don't really have to mess with it, but when you try clicking OK, it tells us you must enter data to describe the option class. Okay, and you go, well, okay, whatever that means. So, click up here and you mess around a little bit, you click OK again. You must enter data to describe the option class. Kind of a weird thing here, but you have to actually click in this box underneath here where it says ASCII. And it doesn't really matter what you do. I typically just type in the same thing that I had up top. So I'm just going to use the name accounting once again. Try and spell that correctly. Okay, accounting. And it's just wrapped around here. I didn't hit enter to space down here. Okay, then I click OK, and now it lets me create it. And you see here it adds this class, so now I have an accounting class. Okay, so I close this, and now we're going to go back over to those same scope options that we were just looking at a second ago. And remember, we got there by right-clicking, configure options, and then I went to the advanced tab. Now remember before we just had the 3 classes. Well, now when I select this, I have the accounting class that shows up here. Okay, so I click this accounting class. And this class here, if you look, it doesn't have anything set, which makes sense because we just created this class. So there's, right now there are no available options selected because we didn't do anything yet. Now remember, our goal was to change the default gateway setting and have it point instead of to 1.254 here to a different default gateway. So we're going to select this option, and now I'm going to enter the IP address of that different default gateway. And we'll just make believe here that it's 192.168.1.250. Okay, that's the secret default gateway that we're trying to get out to. So I click Add. Then I click OK. And then we get something interesting here. We actually get 2 different assignments here. And you have to be careful when you're looking at this because, upon first glance, when you look at this, you go, well, why do I have 2 default gateway assignments? That doesn't make sense. This seems to be my default gateway assignment, and they really look identical. These symbols are the same and everything. Well, because the screen resolution is so low, we can't see over here to the right. So I'm going to move this over a little bit and see if we can't sneak this in. Okay, if you see here, it does show our class, okay? And the class here is accounting. So what this means basically is this setting here is only going to apply to client computers that are members of this class called accounting. Okay, these other settings will apply to everybody. These are more general settings. So just to give you a general overview, if a member of the marketing department logs on and gets its IP address from a DHCP server, it will get this default gateway and this DNS server setting. If a member of the accounting department logs on, well, they're going to get their IP address, and instead of getting this default gateway, they're going to get this default gateway setting. They don't get 2, they're only going to get this 1 default gateway setting. Now they still will get this DNS server setting because there's no more specific class setting than this DNS server setting that we have here. Okay, so just to give you a rough feel of how that works. Now, let's go take a look from the client's perspective. How does all this work? How does it fit together? How the heck does it know it's part of the accounting class? Okay, because this has nothing to do with Active Directory groups. There's no accounting groups. You don't log on with the name accounting or anything like that. This refers to the actual computer setting. So let's minimize this. Okay, and then let's go here. Now we're sitting back on our XP1 machine, and what we're going to do is make this machine a DHCP client. So to do this, we're just going to come up here to My Network Places, right-click. Okay, then we're going to go to Properties. Okay, go to Properties again, and we're going to have it obtain an IP address automatically. Okay, so I selected both of these settings. I click OK, and now what should happen is this machine should broadcast on a network looking for a DHCP server. Okay, so it's done. Now we're going to go to a command prompt, and we're going to enter in ipconfig all to show us all of our IP settings. Okay, and if we look here, we see the host name is XP1. Okay, it's got an IP address. DHCP is enabled, by the way. It says yes, so we know that it is working. And then here's the DHCP server that we connected to. And this is important information for both troubleshooting and also to see if DHCP is working appropriately on your network. Okay, so it is. And now let's take a look at the information that was gathered. Here it picked up an IP address that fits within the scope, 1.1. Subnet mask matches. Default gateway, however, take a look at that. It picked up 1.254, okay, and not the 1.250 that we set up. Okay, if you look here, it picked up this one and not this accounting class. And the reason, well, it's because we didn't configure this computer to be a member of this accounting class. Okay, so currently it's not a member of the accounting class. Well, let's talk about how we can do that. Okay, so right now this machine is it's out there. It is basically just part of the, it could be a marketing or salesperson. It's just acting like any old computer on the network. To change this setting, you need to go to our command prompt here. Okay, and I'm typing in ipconfig space / and then set class ID, okay, then another space, and this is important here, but we have to make sure we know the name of our network card. Okay, and the name of this network card is just local space area space connection, and it has to be typed exactly as you see it. And you also have to pay attention to this. If we had renamed this network card to something a little bit simpler, like Bob, we could just type in Bob. If you're using this one, you'd have to add the 3 in here. So this name has to match up to the actual name of this network card. Okay, and this name goes in quotes. So local area connection, end quote. Okay, another space, and now the name of the class that you want it to join. And we just set up that accounting class, and this is case sensitive, so it's ACCOUNTING. Okay, now if we hit enter, if that class exists, it should join this computer to that class. Okay, and we'll give it a second here to see if this is going to work. Okay, successfully set the class ID for the adapter local area connection. Now you can run this command as well. Show class ID space asterisk. Okay, and what this should do is show all the classes that this local system is part of. Now, I'll tell you right now, and when I hit enter, it may or may not work because I found this setting to be very, very intermittent. I've gone through and I've tested it and gone through different settings, and sometimes it shows a class, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it seems like it's showing classes that it doesn't belong to. Okay, so this time it looks like it's going to work out. Now, this stuff is all kind of jumbled together. It's hard to read, but we've got DHCP classes for adapter local area connection. Okay, and we see that here's the name. It is a member of default routing and remote access class. Here's the description, user class for remote access clients. That's one class. Here's the second class ID, default boot P class, user class for boot P clients. And then here's the third class, accounting. This is the one we just added right now. Description, secure network access. We typed in that description ourselves. Okay, and another class it's part of that's not mentioned here is that default class. Okay, coming back over here to server 3, remember that we have the default user class. Well, everybody is a member of that, so it's just not listed as one of the classes here. Okay, so it's actually part of all 4. Now let's see what happens when we run ipconfig and we release our IP address. Okay. First off, notice that now all of a sudden it knows that it's part of the accounting class. Well, let's see what happens when I run ipconfig renew. Okay, and this is just basically rebroadcasting back out there on the network, asking that DHCP server for information. Okay, take a look at the settings we have now. Now the IP address is good, the mask is good, but now our default gateway has been changed, that special accounting class default gateway, 192.168.1.250. If I want to, I can take a look at some more information by typing in ipconfig all. And what you'll see here is that even though we picked up that class ID, the different default gateway, our DNS server setting still applies. Okay, we didn't get a special DNS server. It's exactly the same as before. So that's the good news here, is that we're able to pull the general information as well as the specific information that you see here. Okay, so pretty cool feature. Kind of confusing at first, but once you get a feel for it, it's really not too bad. Now, a couple things to note about this class ID. Okay, if we want to take a quick look at it, remember we can see it right here. It shows us our DHCP class ID. When we reboot our systems, this doesn't go away. So this is actually part of the network card settings until we want it to go away. Okay, and the command to make it go away is ipconfig all, set class ID, just like you see here, the name of the actual interface, except now instead of typing the class ID, make this blank. So now I'm backspacing over this, and now it's just basically taking away that class ID. If I hit enter right now, you see that we successfully set the class ID adapter for local area connection. If I type in ipconfig, you see that there is no DHCP class ID. Okay, so that's how you handle that particular configuration. Now, one last thing we want to take a look at in regards to this. A couple of other options we can do. That, by the way, don't get confused by this, but that is the main functionality to assign, user-specific settings. What we have, though, up here, we also have something called vendor class. Okay, and these vendor class options, these can be set for any of these different classes as you just saw here. So for the default user class, if I want to take a look at some different options, maybe I don't want to look at just DHCP standard options, I want to look at Microsoft options, well, I can look at those. Okay, any changes I make right now, they're going to be associated to this default user class, so everybody will get them. If I wanted to set up some, let's say, some more secure settings for my accounting department, I would have to select accounting and now make these options in accordance with the accounting. Okay, for example, right now I've got the user class accounting selected. I changed my vendor class up here. Instead of all of these standard options that we always see, I went to some Microsoft specific options. And there's not a lot here. There's only 3 settings here, okay, that we can change. But if I select this one, for example, let's just go ahead and do this and click OK. When we look over here, we see that this particular scope option is only set for the accounting class. If I wanted it to be set for everybody, then I got to make sure that it says none over here. So I'd have to go back in here and go, oops, that's not what I wanted. I can delete that option. Then I'm going to come back in here again, go to advanced, default user class. Remember, that's for everybody. Now I can go to my Microsoft options and select Microsoft Disable Net BIOS option. Now when I click OK, if I look here, I still have that exact same option to disable NetBIOS, except now there are no class restrictions. So NetBIOS will be disabled for everybody, not just the people who are part of the accounting class. So kind of a cool feature that we can do here, and these are important settings, by the way, too. Two of these settings anyway, if you look at these Microsoft options, this is a cool one because here we can disable NetBIOS for all the different computers. You may or may not be familiar with this, and this is something we cover in a lot of depth in Lab 6 on Wins. But NetBIOS is a application program interface that's used with legacy systems, okay, pre-Windows 2000 basically. So once we get all the pre-Windows 2000 systems and applications off of our network, we may want to disable NetBIOS, which will speed up our network and also pose less of a security risk for us. Here's a real quick way of disabling NetBIOS on all the computers in our network without having to go from system to system to system doing it. Okay, and then a second option here, Microsoft released DHCP lease on shutdown. What this does is every time a computer shuts itself down, it's going to basically give back its IP address. And what this will prevent is traveling users, laptop users, people on wireless networks. It'll prevent them from taking a lease out on an IP address and then basically tying up that IP address for the whole lease duration, which could be, it's 8 days by default. We're going to talk more about this when we get into leases. We'll spend some time talking about this and we'll revisit this option there. But these two options are definitely useful and something to pay attention to. And you don't see them on the default options, so it's easy to neglect them and forget about them. Okay, so we're going to leave this as is here right now. We're going to go back over to XP1 and take a look here at our last piece, and this is the DHCP request process. And what we basically have here, we're going to take a look at the mechanics of DHCP just briefly here to give you a feel for how it works. This is definitely test fodder if you're an MCSE test taker. And we're going to take a look at a diagram to make this simpler. Okay, and what we're looking at here is basically what happens when a DHCP client boots up over the network. Okay, so you turn your computer on, and this computer right now, remember, is a DHCP client. What happens when I turn it on? Well, the first thing, it starts broadcasting out over the network, and that's what these different arrows are representative of. It's not looking for anybody in particular. It's broadcasting out there, basically saying, hey, I'm looking for an IP address. Can anybody help me out? And this phase here is called the DHCP Discover phase. And if memory serves me correctly, you do need to know these by phase name as well for the MCSE certification test. Okay, DHCP Discover phase. So this machine's going out there, it's looking for DHCP servers. Now, step 2, this is the DHCP offer. Now, there might be more than one DHCP server out there. We may have several DHCP servers. Okay, and remember, this is just broadcast based up here, so any of these servers may make an offer back to the client. What to do? Okay, well, basically what happens, when this many DHCP servers are offering an IP address back to the client, this client has to make a decision. It obviously can't take 3 different IP addresses and try to, start working from there. So what it basically does is it accepts the first offer. Okay, whoever gets back to this client first, that's who it goes with, and it's going to go ahead and accept that IP address. So this machine then will accept that IP address, and what happens here, it makes a DHCP request, which is step 3. So this machine has basically said, hey, I'm offering up 192.168.1.10, this subnet mask, these scope options, what do you think? In step 3, this machine goes, you know what? That sounds like a good offer. I'm requesting that you give me that IP address. Okay, because if these 3 machines all made an offer, well, we have to make sure that they're still available. So that's why this request is going, taking place. After a certain period of time, these 2 machines up here who also made an offer, they'll basically realize that they were, neglected, that this is the machine that this DHCP client's communicating with, and they'll re-offer up those IP addresses that they originally offered over here to the XP machine. Okay, so a request is made basically saying, hey, I like your offer, I'll take that IP address information, the default gateway, the scope options, anything you have configured, they're for me. Okay, and the final step is the step 4, which is the DHCP ACK or acknowledgement. Okay, this basically, there's got to be this final confirmation. Okay, we requested it, we're saying yes, we definitely want it, and this machine is saying you've got it. Here they are. Okay. And then this step, step 4 here is finalizing the process. It's leasing this IP address now out here to our XP machine, and this XP machine can now start using that IP address. So fairly straightforward process, but I do recommend that you go through. If you want a more detailed look at this, take a look at some Microsoft documentation. They'll give you even more details than what you see right here. But frankly, this is all theoretical stuff behind the scenes that you can't really see anyway. So I think that this is pretty substantial as far as the detail that you're getting. Okay, so that wraps up our DHCP Concepts video. We'll see you back here real soon. We're going to get started on this lab, so we'll see you in Lab 1.